Remember record collections? Especially rock and roll record collections. If you have an old favorite album stored away somewhere, take some time to look at the liner notes. It may say recorded in Miami. In fact, some of rock and roll's most memorable songs were recorded here. And the man behind the music is Mack Emerman, founder of the original Criteria recording studios in North Miami. It was his vision that brought an entire industry to South Florida. In part one of a new three-part series, The Music Man, we'll go back to Mack's humble beginnings, when life was simpler, and the family garage was used for more than storing cars and garden tools. Here's part one of The Music Man.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Mack Emerman.
In the world of audio boards and microphones, Mack Emerman is being applauded as a Florida hero for his 50 years as a guiding force in the record business. He risked building a recording studio in an unlikely place. And from this tiny seed of an idea grew an establishment where some of the world's most famous artists would be recorded for generations to come. Today, it stands as a testimony to Florida's recording industry and to the man who dared to survive it. Born in 1923 in Erie, Pennsylvania, Emerman's fascination with music began when he was 9. It followed him during his adolescent years, and in 1941, he enrolled at Duke University to study business and play trumpet with a hotshot big band called the Duke Ambassadors. Then came December 7th, 1941. Emerman did his patriotic duty and enlisted in the Navy's college ROTC program, where he was trained to spot enemy aircraft. He was assigned to the USS New Mexico, serving in the South Pacific.
I was tootling on that horn that's sitting right behind me, down on the deck below the gun deck, and the sirens started to go off, and we knew we were being attacked. And my particular battle station was at the very top of the battleship. And as I started up the stairway, a naval officer said, "Don't go up there." And he grabbed me by the pant leg and pulled me down on top of him. And we fell down 2 flights of steps. And at that very instant, the Japanese MiG hit where I would have been standing, and that's the truth. We lost 150 people at that time, and the ship was badly damaged.
In my solitude. As the battered ship made its way back to Boston, Mack Emerman was eagerly awaiting his return to Duke, where he would soon discover a new passion for audio recording.
I went out and bought a wire recorder so we could record off the radio. And that actually was the first recordings that I ever did with a little wire recorder.
Meanwhile, he had met and married a young co-ed named Ann Clark, whom friends called Chili. Mack and Chili Emerman moved to Hollywood, Florida.
Crazy rhythm, here's the doorway. I'll go my way, you'll go your way.
But thoughts of recording would play over and over in his mind, despite the comfortable living he was making.
His obsession with music was slowly starting to take over his life. This was sort of a self-acquired knowledge, but he immediately decided that our garage, which to him was wasted space for the car and garden tools, would actually make a pretty good studio.
And he would run wires from the living room through the kitchen and then out into the garage. We'd recorded the background tracks for the jingles at the Armory in North Miami. And so he would then yell, "Are you ready?" And then he'd shut the door, and we'd hear our backgrounds, and we'd sing WQRS and whatever it was, and we would just do those over and over again.
You wanna buy a Ford? Austin, Austin, buy a Ford from Austin. You'll find the deal you've been looking for. Austin can give you a great deal more. They give the highest trades in town, low monthly payments, far less down.
Hauling his equipment in the family station wagon, Emerman also recorded performances at local jazz clubs.
Herbie Brock and I were working a trio job on a beach on Alton Road in a place called Herbie's Room. Mack came in with his equipment and set the equipment up in the bar outside and recorded us while we played in the room. It was pretty interesting. And he got a wonderful balance on the recording. It's unbelievable.
Emerman's innovative way of thinking was only a hint of things to come.
I came up with the idea of there's no record label here. I'm going to start a record label.
Criteria Records was born, and the Herbie Brock recording Herbie's Room became the first in a series of Gold Coast jazz releases. But a record label wasn't enough.
People were doing recording in stores and other locations, but not of really professional quality that would equal what was in New York or California. And I designed a little 30 by 60 building. That was the very start of the Criteria saga.
In 1958, Mack Emerman founded Criteria Studios in North Miami. And when he opened its doors, word traveled faster than the speed of sound.
We just got the place sort of functioning, and knocked on the front door, went and opened the door because I was the only one there, obviously. And lo and behold, it was Benny Goodman.
The legendary bandleader had been vacationing off the coast of Florida when he heard about a convenient little studio in Miami.
He says, I want to make a recording for a gentleman who had a terrible cold at the time. I'll never forget it. So we put together a quintet. We had piano and bass and drums. And, we made a very nice record, which he took the tape, and that was it.
Emerman visited other studios around the country, constantly looking for ways to improve Criteria. While in New York, he met Tom Dowd, a respected producer for Atlantic Records.
He visited different studios. He visited California to see the Capitol studio. He visited CBS to see the studio there. And he heard I had a studio with an unusual machine. So he just walked into my studio one day and introduced himself.
Emerman also struck up a friendship with G. Parnett, an electronics genius who owned a small fix-it shop in Fort Lauderdale.
I remember they were always doing something innovative. I mean, they'd think it, and the next thing you know, they'd create it. And it was always working and became the standard for the industry later on.
By the early 60s, rock and roll had hypnotized the nation, and Criteria was catching on, attracting the likes of Chubby Checker, Diana Ross, and Bobby Rydell. But it had yet to earn the reputation as a hitmaker. That is, until James Brown came to town.
Wow, I feel good.
After receiving his first gold record for I Feel Good in 1966, things would never be the same for Mack Emerman.
So good, I got you.
Criteria now had the capability to turn out major hits, and the kings and queens of the music world would follow a trail of gold all the way to Miami.
Mack Emerman was finally on his way. Next week, in part 2 of The Music Man, we'll follow his rapid rise to success in the 1970s and his tragic downfall in the 80s.
It's hard to believe that one of the world's most famous recording studios was born in a garage in South Florida nearly 50 years ago. It later became Criteria Studios. When Mack Emerman opened Criteria's doors in 1958, word spread like wildfire, so much so that legendary bandleader Benny Goodman wanted to try it out for himself. But it wasn't until Emerman's recording of James Brown's I Feel Good in 1966 that Criteria started turning out gold records. This week, in part 2 of our 3-part series, The Music Man, a powerful record company takes notice of Emerman's golden touch, and he's catapulted into fame and fortune, only to find out that what goes up eventually has to come down. Here's part 2 of The Music Man.
Wow, I feel good.
To pursue his dream of making a name in the music industry, Mack Emerman began a record label and built Miami's first recording studio, Criteria Recording Company. But it wasn't until his recording of James Brown's I Feel Good that he and Criteria would finally take off. Ironically, The ongoing trends in rock and roll were not easy for Emerman to embrace, in spite of the studio's success. Because he was an engineer who loved the sophisticated patterns of jazz, he needed to hire people who were more in tune with the times. Enter the Albert brothers, Howard and Ron.
When Howard came to work, he says, hey, why is that? We can't control the tom-toms or the cymbals or the hi-hat. Why don't we put a microphone on each instrument? And that was really the beginning of it all, because as soon as our record started being heard, our drum sound became so unique to what else was going on at the time that they said, hey, let's go down to Florida and check this out.
What they came up with was a sound separation process called the close miking technique. This larger-than-life sound attracted Atlantic Records president Jerry Wexler, who believed Mack's studio would be the ideal home for the record company's southern operations. It would bring a steady stream of rock royalty, including the Queen of Soul, Aretha Franklin.
We started using criteria and flying the horn sections in, or come what may. Sometimes we bring Aretha and all of the musicians from New York or Memphis or Muscle Shoals that we wanted to use, and rent the studio for a week and lock it out and have a jolly old time, whether it was the Rascals, Aretha Franklin, whatever you wanted.
Overwhelmed by his studio's success, Mack needed more help. So he hired a bright young engineer named Carl Richardson.
I was hired as a mastering engineer to actually cut the grooves in the vinyl. The atmosphere was wonderful. A bunch of young people, we were just, trying to make great recordings. I mean, that was really our goal.
In 1971, Eric Clapton and Duane Allman of the Allman Brothers collaborated as Derek and the Dominoes to record a rock and roll classic about a wayward woman named Layla.
Once we started recording, everybody and his brother wanted to get in and be engineer on one session. It didn't matter who it was.
Arguably, we've recorded one of the classic rock and roll tracks of all time. Layla has stood the test of time, and I think, Stairway to Heaven and Layla are about the two pinnacle pieces of rock and roll history that there ever are.
By now, Criteria's popularity had reached universal appeal. Artists like the Bee Gees wanted the Criteria sound, recording hits like Nights on Broadway and Jive Talking, which shot to #1 on the charts.
Jive Talking was written, if I remember right, they were all going back home on the beach one night, and the sound of the causeway, the roadway and the causeway, produced this rhythm. Ching, chinka, ching, chinka, ching, chinka. And that became Jive Talking. If you listen to Nights on Broadway, there's this high-pitched male singing in one of the background parts, and of course that's Barry, and he discovered that he had so much control in that voice at the time.
By 1975, the Criteria sound had saturated the airwaves. This kind of popularity was keeping the studio booked around the clock. But success in the business of rock and roll wasn't satisfying to the man who loved recording jazz. So Mack Emerman looked elsewhere for satisfaction. Now divorced and remarried to second wife Danny, he began living with the same intensity he had once put into his music.
It wasn't really until my parents were divorced, though, that my father really started living high off the hog. He's an incredibly generous person, and his philosophy of life is if you have it, spend it. My father always had a sports car. Usually it was red. He'd had his license revoked several times for speeding. He was always asking for it because he always drove a red sports car, and so naturally he was a moving target for cops everywhere.
He'd get back into his office and he would just sit there for hours, and because he wasn't recording, he wasn't doing the hands-on stuff. He was doing the business, which he hated.
Just leave a message, maybe I'll call.
In 1979, A national oil shortage crippled the music industry. The crude, essential for making vinyl records, was in short supply. Emerman struggled to cut costs and remain optimistic.
I think it was 79 or 80 when we had the oil crisis and things, it was a big crunch and a lot of things stopped in the industry, including our own careers. They hit a big wall at the time.
When that economy downturned and when he was caught with the studio in an expansion mode, when the entire industry was contracting and not doing the same sessions that they used to do, he really did not know how to deal with that.
In the 1980s, the compact disc was quickly moving the recording industry into a digital age. Caught in a mire of debt and technological change, Emerman couldn't keep up. In 1988, he sold Criteria to a Fort Lauderdale real estate developer at a loss. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life.
At first, they were going to be partners in the business, or at least that's how my father was seeing it. And all of a sudden, my father was just without everything. Everything that mattered to him was gone. On top of all of this, he started having problems with his hearing. So his one great pleasure in life, listening to music, even that was denied him.
For an engineer not to be able to hear the nuances, let alone just, talking to people, is a disaster. And of course it, further, caused the reason to just disappear, and he did disappear.
Mack Emerman's world fell silent. Criteria had slipped away, and the recording industry he'd helped pioneer would turn its back. The engineer whose studio had amassed over 280 gold records was shunned away. Overwhelmed with great sadness, he withdrew, not to emerge again for several years, until the day a small miracle would bring him back.
Mack Emerman had lost his music and his livelihood and withdrew from everyone and everything important to his life. In our upcoming conclusion of The Music Man, we'll see how eventually the music returns for Emerman, helping to put his life back together again.
Mack Emerman was one of the founding fathers of Florida's music industry, so it might seem that his rise to fame and fortune would be steady and sure. His Criteria studios generated over 280 gold records in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But after a string of setbacks, Criteria's financial health began to falter. Emerman was forced to sell Criteria, and when he did, his dreams were sold as well. In part 3 of our 3-part series, The Music Man, the music finally returns, and so does Mack Emerman. Here's part 3 of The Music Man.
Wow, I feel good.
Mack Emerman built Criteria Recording Company in Miami during the infant days of rock and roll. After the success of James Brown's I Feel Good in 1966, he never looked back. For a while, it seemed nothing could stop his momentum. But an oil shortage and a shifting industry would prove otherwise. After selling the studio in 1988, Mack Emerman was facing the greatest challenge of his existence. Afraid he was losing his hearing, Mack struggled to find life after Criteria.
I would call him and he was so depressed he wouldn't even take my calls for more than 2-3 minutes at a time. He didn't see his grandchildren. But I was told by a very smart person, never stop trying.
He was just not in a good frame of mind, to say the least. He had been put in a box, was definitely a far cry from the Mack Emerman who started Criteria and created that whole place.
Everybody hurts sometimes.
Then one day, Emerman paid a visit to an ear specialist who found and removed blockage in his ears. The man who thought he'd lost his music forever could actually hear it again.
That was really the beginning of my turnaround, because after that I came back and I set up the little stereo system and I put on the Pandyman AM album that I'd done with the concert jazz band, and I started to cry.
He went through this incredible transformation. We used to always go, Mack is back. After this long, horrible depression, Mack was back.
And one day he came knocking on our door. We were shocked, and he came over and we welcomed him and told him he had a home here, which he does, and Mack's been here since.
It's kind of a very interesting full circle of events, because the real nucleus of the Criteria heyday was obviously Mack and Howard and I and Carl Richardson. And the reality of it is that now, in current times, it's Mack and Howard and I and Carl Richardson.
Brown paper packages wrapped up with strings. These are a few of my favorite things.
Now, with a newfound vibrancy and the pressure of running a studio off his back, Mack Emerman was free to start again. So he went back to where he began, recording live jazz performances just as he had done so many years ago.
He's having a ball. He goes around, he records people, he goes to clubs and records them. He's having a good time. And he's like the old Mack.
In the meantime, a small record company in California had heard about some old recordings that were made in the 1950s in Miami. Those recordings were from Emerman's Gold Coast series.
One day I got a call from a gentleman from San Diego, California, who said he owned a label called VSOP Records. And he said, I'm very interested in those albums you did back in 1957, 58. And he said, would you be interested in having them come out as CDs? And I said, of course.
And so the hunt for clean copies of the albums began.
We had to get a hold of everybody that we ever knew that had copies of this stuff until we could find one that was clean enough to make a master out of it. And it took us about a year to get all this stuff together.
In the year 2000, VSOP re-released the early Criteria recordings of Herbie's Room, the Lon Norman Sextet, the Modern Jazz Orchestra, and the Octet. These albums are now considered to be collector's items. Decades earlier, in 1958, Benny Goodman had come to Criteria to make a recording. He took his tapes and left, never to be heard from. Until one day, at a local record store, Mack Emerman would make a surprising discovery.
I looked through the set, and sure enough, I spotted the one that I thought was the 1958 recording. And when I saw the people on it, I knew it was.
Goodman had left his recordings to Yale University's music library. Years after his death, the university put them on CDs and released them to the public. Mack's career had come full circle. Looking back, he's proud of his legacy and counts the many blessings he's received over the years.
I'm involved with all the people that I love. And of course, I'm doing all the stuff that I like to do, the live recording.
The studio is now known as the Hit Factory Criteria. In keeping true to its heritage, it still attracts the music industry's biggest and brightest.
Criteria was always known for a really special sound. It was subtle, but it was right on the money every time with those hits, and I don't know if those hits would have become hits if they'd been recorded somewhere else.
Mack Emerman was recognized by the Florida chapter of the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences. The engineer with a passion for jazz was finally being recognized by his peers. It's the crowning achievement in a career that has spanned almost 50 years.
He is one of our heroes of South Florida. He foresaw that people would come to South Florida because of what it is and where it is. And so I think he was a futurist and a pioneer.
To lose my father from the music business would just be a tragedy. He's just got too much vision and talent, even at his age now, than anybody I can think of. So, you know, it's a story with a happy ending.
Mack Emerman currently lives in Miami and records live jazz performances every chance he gets.